The International Financial Action Task Force has grey-listed South Africa after monitoring the country for about 2 years ago. Last year, the global anti-money laundering body announced that South Africa needed more prosecutions and the freezing of more assets to demonstrate its compliance. The watchdog's decision signals to global banks, financial institutions and investors that South Africa is not fully compliant with anti-money laundering and terrorist financing standards. Let's understand what this means and speak to Khaya Sithole now, an economist joining us by phone tonight. Khaya, grateful for your time. So let's start on that very point. What does this mean in practical terms?
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. I'm just an accountant, not an economist. So the main thing, unfortunately, is that for those institutions and maybe even those individuals that are South African that want to transact and engage in transactions with foreign counterparties, the cost of compliance and the process of compliance is suddenly a bit different, because what this report is saying is that, look, in South Africa, we have a country that struggles to explain where some of the cash that flows within the country originated from. We have a country that struggles to explain who owns some of the organizations where some monies may be moved through, and people aren't in a position to always explain what is happening within particular corporate structures. So when you're dealing with this country, please be aware that it may just turn out, we do not know yet, but it may turn out that some of the finances that is related to a particular transaction has got some illicit origins. So that's really what the whole process is. And the answer here is that the only way to be able to explain what happens within your country's financial ecosystem is to have the right rules and to have the right regulations that force people that transact to be able to explain where the money came from and how they can, explain where they get their source of wealth from. So that's really what the main issue is here. And South Africa systems, unfortunately, were found wanting in many of those particular instances. And until you've got systems that are much more able to enable the state to know who's doing what, who's paying who's transacting in what form, then you do actually end up on the grey list.
Right. And let's just, because I know there are multiple reports that look at the movement of money for terrorism financing, illicit flows more broadly, but is there a clear enough picture of to what extent the gaps in our legislation or preventative measures have been exploited? Do we know?
So what happens is that we undergo something that we refer to as an evaluation report. So that was done a couple of years ago. And within that evaluation report, what the FATF will do is that they'll say, look, in relation to transactions of this nature, these are the systems that you need to have in place in order for you as a state to have a sense of comfort that, look, we know who's doing it and we know where the money is going and we know what the purposes are. So when you then get tested against those particular parameters and you're found wanting, then it becomes very clear that your systems are not fit for purpose. And I think in recent years, obviously, as you've seen the globalization of the world of finance and the world of commerce, one of the biggest risks is that there are some terrorist organizations across the globe that get supported or they get financed by countries all over the globe. And the whole point here is that if you have individuals in your country who are empathetic towards a particular cause and they're happy to then use your financial systems to then support those organizations, then you essentially are supporting terrorism. So that's where the terrorist financing aspect of it comes in. So that's just one of the aspects that evaluation report told us a couple of years ago. And then we were given a grace period to say, look, guys, if you undertake processes that are going to close these loopholes we told you about, that are going to deal with these red flags, then you'll be fine. And then South Africa spent the next couple of years dealing with other issues, forgot about what to do, and then now we've been grey-listed.
And it's worth noting, though, that while we have been grey-listed, not all is lost, because there was significant work done, just not enough. And I think there are about, 8 areas now where we've been told as a country that we need to quickly improve on.
Well, the point here is that the FATF is an organization that doesn't get sold on just optics. So what you would remember is that towards the end of last year, National Treasury finally managed to convince members of parliament that we had a crisis looming. So what National Treasury was then able to do is that they were able to submit a range of bills at the very last moment that then got converted into law. But unfortunately, by the time that happened, the FATF had already made it clear that it is not sufficient for you to say we've written a new law, we've written a new regulation. The new laws and the new regulations have to be tested against actual case studies. So we need to know how they stand up scrutiny when somebody indeed wants to be able to transact and send $1 million or two to some terrorist organization in the middle of nowhere. So because the rules have been written but they haven't been tested, it actually became a bit meaningless that you were doing all these rules at the last minute. However, as you'd have seen from today's report, what this report simply says is that, well, actually, we acknowledge that they've undertaken some steps towards, dealing with the issues that have been raised. So the whole point of saying you're on the grey list is that we are actually going to monitor your ability to then execute and implement the rules that you've written. So once you do it properly, then we'll be able to take you off the grey list, but you do not know whether that will happen anytime soon.
And they want to see, for example, an increase in investigations as well as prosecutions for money laundering, the seizure of assets due to those related crimes. You mentioned a key point. We don't know if this will happen soon. How easy is it for a country to come off the grey list once you're on there?
Well, the most difficult aspect of this, unfortunately, is that we do not know when there will be a test case. So we do not know when the Financial Intelligence Center is going to stumble upon a transaction that they look at and then they say, wait, hold on, we are uncomfortable about what's going on here. Let us test it against the new rules that are put together and then see what the outcomes are. So it may well turn out that for the next day, absolutely nothing happens because nothing comes to the fore that then enables us to test the effectiveness of these particular rules and regulations. If, however, we are lucky enough to then see a whole lot of test cases that emerge in the medium term that then enable us to be able to say, look, when this happened 2 years ago, we would have missed it because our old rules and regulations were incapable of tracking that. We are now able to track it because we've got new rules, so therefore the system is working. Please take us off the grey list.
And it has been grey listing in the past linked to a drop in foreign investment. Is it automatic that that is what will follow now that we're in this position?
Yes, definitely, because I think what tends to happen in the world of finance is that there are so many options for investors in particular to explore. So if it turns out that in the South African context, the cost of doing a transaction with a South African business or the South African government suddenly attracts an additional layer of complexity, an additional layer of cost, then you'll simply say, well, actually, let me find the next best option, someone who doesn't have the same problems that South Africa has. So you then start losing access to some of those deals, to some of those investments on the basis that people say, well, why should we bother dealing with that extra layer of complexity when there's many other countries that do not attract that additional layer of complexity? So the reports that have been conducted by intelligence in particular do indicate that there is indeed a loss of some investments coming this way on the basis that some people just don't want to deal with the question of the additional complexity, particularly when it's something that could have been resolved.
Khaya Sithole, good to speak to you. Accountant Khaya Sithole speaking to us today about the grey listing of South Africa.